Hello, everyone. Today is September 22nd. This is the SIG Release bi-weekly meeting. This is a meeting that is recorded and will be available on the internet, so please be mindful of what you say and do. Please be sure to adhere to the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, and in general, just be awesome people. So we've got two main agenda items today, the first of which I see a bunch of the working group LTS folks here. So welcome, good seeing you all. The first of which is going to be a discussion on the working group LTS turndown. So I guess, Tim, you want to take it away?
Yeah, so for folks maybe who are unfamiliar, starting around 2.5 years ago, there were some semi-formal discussions about the support term for our releases. Those kind of grew across a couple of KubeCons to the point of 2 years ago, a set of us deciding to propose a working group for what we called LTS, which a lot of people know to mean long-term support and maybe a very specific implementation. But we tried to keep the discussion very broad and open to talk about how do we as a project support our releases and what does our community want from us for support. So working groups, once formed in Kubernetes, are supposed to be time-boxed, and they are something that's not a code-owning entity, unlike SIGs. So they're a place then to focus conversation. And that's what we tried to do, be a forum where a bunch of disparate stakeholders across the community, across multiple SIGs, sub-projects, working groups, the whole thing, that we could have some open discussions and try to capture desires, formulate those into some requirements or actions that were proposed. So out of that came a KEP last year, I guess it was. And then by the beginning of this year, that was ratified in terms of declaring that we're changing from a 9-month support term for a given release to a 12-month support term. And those are both a little bit fuzzy because we never quite did 9. It was 9 plus a little, and we would continue to do 12 plus a little because you want just a little bit of overlap on things. Maybe you have some late breaking changes, stragglers decide to upgrade and discover the upgrade path is broken. So that was our primary focus over the last while, but additionally we had some other things that we had talked about doing. There was, and not just talked, did. Jordan's here, he spearheaded a lot of work around defining where we had gaps in supportability and working to rectify those. I think at this point that kind of relates to ongoing work out of SIG architecture, SIG's release and testing, the CI signal project that's coming up, the way we handle enhancements and talk about graduation criteria across alpha, beta, stable, and even now the new, upcoming working group reliability. So there are similar forums that exist and feel like logical places for the other things that we've talked about for the most part to happen. The main remaining thing that we had talked about possibly within the working group, but initially we kind of split. We realized we had two conversations. What is the support term and what is the release cadence? If we're releasing something once a year, probably makes sense to support it for at least a year, or you run out of support before the next release comes, right? But what we've done for quite some time now is we've had 4 releases per year. The 9 months thing was just a pragmatic approach in a lot of ways to say that you have 3 releases that are under support and you can sort of be stepping along through those and still have supportability within that. Many people operationalize things on the calendar year or the business year. So there was a desire for that. And we focused on seeing what it would take to get there. The conversation about what is a good release cadence is a complicated one. And we've had this sort of pragmatic in between. And there are people who want it to go in both directions, shorter and longer, for reasons valid on both sides. So it's a complicated balancing act. And I think Josh, Nick, others, if you want to chime in any more on any of this or that part especially, there just wasn't clear consensus. It wasn't clear that we would drive an action that would close to some proposal on that. So that kind of leaves us then in a place where, without some additional new push to accomplish that, we've done what we see us getting done. And it makes sense probably to go ahead and close down the working group and in the way that they're intended. We've time boxed, we focused on some things, we got them done. So I guess with that conversation, kind of open it up to broader discussion.
Well, I guess from my point of view as one of the other chairs, yeah, I think to me, I thought that a lot of the value was in the conversations we had about what, not only about what LTS meant, but all of the stuff that we ended up finding that we needed to fix. As you said, Tim, Jordan's done heaps and heaps of amazing work on sorting most of that out. But yeah, and I think we did have a lot of discussion about both the release cadence and a whole bunch of other stuff like install processes and being able to jump multiple versions and all this sort of stuff that I think that has been what we ended up talking about, has been pretty well disseminated across the community since we talked about it. With the release cadence, yeah, I think the distribution of opinion was definitely bimodal. There was definitely a few people who felt very strongly that we should be releasing like once a month dev branches with a stable branch cut, a stable release cut at some other time frame, like something like the Linux kernel or something like that. And there were other people who were like, yeah, we should totally have a 3-year actual long-term support release. I think personally, I think that is 100% not viable until all of the stuff that is in the process of being pulled out of the core is out of the core. But yeah, anyway, that's a discussion for another time. I think I completely agree with Tim that if there's no one willing to, that will need to be a really big push. And if there's no one willing to really push hard and get a whole bunch of people to talk about that, then it's not going to happen. It's very difficult to get all of the people to talk and to bring some and to get some consensus on that sort of thing, because people do feel really strongly about it.
There were also some other obstacles to a 2-year or 3-year long-term support release, not the least of which is the release cycle of upstream dependencies. So one of the things that we got out of the work in WGLTS was that we discussed, the idea of the sort of whatever it is, Debian Ubuntu long-term release type approach of having like one supported release every 2 years or whatever, and decided that it just was not viable given where the project was at. And that could change in the future, but it's not going to change this year.
Since we're furiously editing the agenda, adding notes, just to clarify, the previous support policy was always stated in terms of releases. And because we had a regular release cadence of 3 months or 4 releases a year, that worked out to about 9 months of support. But we always stated our support policy in terms of releases. So the most recent 3 minor versions were supported. So because 1.19 and 1.20 ended up being 4-month releases, or 1.19 might have been actually slightly longer, that effectively gives 1.18 and 1.17 and 1.16 1-year support windows. So we didn't originally intend for that to happen, but because 1.19 and 1.20 slowed down, the release dates for those meant that the preceding 3 releases ended up getting a year of support. So from 1.19 forward, we've committed to maintaining the release branches for a minimum of a year. If the release cadence picks back up to 3 months, 4 releases a year, then that means we will maintain an extra release. If it stays at 4 months or 3 releases a year, then our 1-year policy and our 3 release policy will continue to coexist. So, but framing the support in terms of time is way easier for people who are consuming those releases to plan around, instead of saying, you say 3 releases, but I don't actually know how long that's going to be.
The future is harder to predict than what we've already delivered.
So for those interested, we are planning on having a discussion around release cadence overall. I think that this was one of the overall leftover things that LTS wanted to chat about. And I put out a very scientific Twitter poll, so at some point I'm going to write up some details on that, and we'll have an official discussion, but I don't want to get into that today.
Tell me more about that, because I'd be interested in scientific Twitter. I'm less
Scientific
interested.
Twitter, right? Scientific Twitter. I gave the people 2 options, which was 3 or 4 releases. Given the elongation of 119, the question became, well, are we doing 3 releases a year now? And we've gotten that question from like multiple forums at this point. So I was like, let's go to the internet. And and a lot of people voted for 3. I think, at the last I checked, 700 people had voted on this poll, this extremely scientific poll. But we got lots of good feedback there too. Like, should it be 2 releases a year? Should it be 1 release a year? So lots of things to dig into. And I think that, some of the conversations that Tim, Jordan, and I have had about like Go release cycles, right, and how we navigate that are going to come into play big time. I think that we're still going to be bounded by our external dependencies, and we need to carefully consider that before making any decisions. But I think for now, we continue at pace and have the discussion for 120 moving forward. Okay. Do we feel that given with us as a stakeholder of Working Group LTS and the Working Group LTS leads on the call, are we comfortable saying that we're going to start turning down LTS?
It's a yes from me.
Yes. I think it clarified a lot of things, had a useful outcome, and clarified a couple questions that can be resolved at the SIG level going forward.
Josh and Tim?
Yep.
We did it. Awesome. So I think one more action item, or one remaining action item that we have is the Working Group LTS report to steering. Do we know status on that, or are they happy for us to call it quits and let that be the status?
It makes sense to do a final readout there, I think.
Yeah,
And
capturing crisply those decisions, the continuing questions is a good idea.
Cool. And do we have someone who is interested in taking point on that, or who has already been taking point on that?
Our existing worker group leads can drive that, yeah.
Sounds good. All right. Any farewell comments for the LTS working group?
I guess I'll say thanks, everybody. It's been real.
Nick is just excited to be able to sleep through the night again.
Yeah, it will be. I gotta admit, I'm not gonna miss waking up at 1:30 in the morning once we every couple of weeks.
We're going to miss seeing you on the phone as much, though.
True. All I got to do now, just got to find my next upstream contribution thing to do.
We got to pull you back into the release team, maybe. Okay. All right.
Okay. Well,
Quick and
I
easy.
will bid you all adieu then. I'm going to go to bed.
All right. Take it easy, Nick. Thanks for dropping by.
Cheers.
Okay, so next up on the agenda, the 120 milestone restriction removal. So this has been, Jordan, do you want to set us up, actually, since you wrote the proposal?
Sure. So because of the long freeze in 119 and the CI issues that we were working through, 120 accumulated a ton of PRs that were pending and approved in LGTM, and I think it was like 120 or something. So we reopened master for merges for 120 in a controlled way, and took about maybe a week and a half or 2 weeks to drain that backlog. And so that was done with different label queries and different milestones and things like that. But the only residual effect of that is that the milestone requirement is still in place, which means that a pull request that is reviewed and LGTM'd and approved must also be in the 120 milestone in order to merge currently. And so the question is, should that restriction be left in place, or should we fall back to what we've done in previous releases, where for most of the release, any pull request that has appropriate review and approval merges, regardless of milestone. And then only at the end of the release, once we get close to code freeze, does the milestone restriction get added back in. So that's the issue on the table.
So I had sent out, I was sending out, every few days updates around the status. So basically the way that we drained the queue was we focused on fixes for failing tests, moved into documentation and PRs tagged kind documentation, our cleanup, then moved into low risk bug fixes. So this is kind of like shuffling PRs between various kind of phased milestones. And then finally, Jordan had a fix for some unit testing stuff, right? Bazel trigger for flakes that merged after the low risk bug fixes. Then we took care of the rest of the bug fixes. And then finally tossed the kind feature and kind deprecation. And then there might have been one or two kind API change PRs into the queue. Since we did that, all of the PRs that were targeted and merge ready at the time that we set the restrictions have merged. So, like Jordan said, the question is, when do we remove this? Previously, I was in favor of maintaining this throughout the milestone. What ends up happening is that's increased burden for every SIG and and kind of increased contributor friction for anyone who is pushing a PR to Kubernetes. I don't have strong opinions at this point. I think there's some value in bolstering our reviewers and approvers, as well as the milestone maintainers, and treating this as something that needs to be actively triaged throughout SIGs. But I'm not sure that the increased friction is worth it. And hearing no succinct reasons about why either way is good or bad, I opened a PR to remove the milestone restriction. So initially we were going to merge that at the end of day yesterday, my time. But we wanted to hold it for this meeting to have a little discussion and see if people feel strongly one way or another.
So I guess the question that I have is what the goal of the milestone requirement is. If it is to ensure that someone who is aware of project health in an area is making decisions about whether features or bugs are appropriate to merge. I'm not sure whether that's accomplishing that or not. Some SIGs do a really good job of triaging their health. Some, it's less obvious that that factors into whether features or bugs get merged. And so if we leave the restriction in place, I anticipate that pushing more people into the milestone maintainers list. And if we already are unsure whether everyone in that list is paying attention to the right signals to make decisions, I don't think adding more people to that list is going to help that issue. So the reliability working group that is suggesting like automated component area feedback seems more likely to be successful than adding a human gate. So my feeling is we've strengthened CI quality and strictness. We're in better shape now than we have been in previous releases. I think falling back to our normal development processes and working on the reliability working group stuff in parallel is probably reasonable.
Yeah, I think a question that arose from this is to your point, because I went on, I wouldn't call it a rant, but I had during one of the I think the last edition of the SIG leads and chairs meeting, this points to a triage problem, right? I think that some of the work that the release team does, every now and again I mention it, I think that eventually the release team goes away, right? In some long in the future, the release team goes away because we've automated enough of these processes and we've strengthened the various components that we care about throughout the release to the point where we don't need cat herders, right, for individual areas. And I think that by having functions like CI signal and bug triage, we actually mask some of the triage that should be happening by other SIGs. So in an increase of the milestone maintainers group, one of the questions that could be asked is, are we sure that milestone maintainers are doing what they're supposed to currently? And do they know that there is some definition of what a milestone maintainer is responsible for today? If not, what's the point of the group, right? Are we, so discuss. Go for it, discuss.
Stephen, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear.
Yeah, okay, so this is a real noob reaction, but what's a milestone maintainer?
So the milestone maintainers group is a group that is maintained. It's a GitHub team that is maintained by SIG Release that allows you access to use the /milestone command, right?
Okay.
Initially, a while ago, I think it's a decent while ago, the milestone maintainer group also had write access over Kubernetes. The current milestone maintainer group 1 gives you access to using the /milestone commands, but it also gives you write access to Kubernetes enhancements, right?
Okay.
So for people maintaining maintaining features, enhancement, tracking issues within Kubernetes enhancements, they would be able to, if they're part of that group, actually edit the descriptions and keep them up to date.
And so they're a part of SIG release and they're separate from contributor SIGs.
So the team, the GitHub team itself overall, because there's kind of like shared ownership across Kubernetes, and some functions in Kubernetes, as well as Kubernetes enhancements. SIG release maintains the group, but the individual SIGs designate milestone maintainers for their components. So there is a combination of, if you look at the milestone maintainer group in k-org, it's k-org config Kubernetes SIG release teams.yaml, right? And within there, you'll be able to see the milestone maintainers group, and within that team, there are comments for each of the SIGs, right? So it'll be a username and then a comment to say that they are a milestone maintainer for a specific SIG.
Mm-hmm. Sorry to cut across, but as part of their responsibilities, are they tasked with taking an active interest, say, in flaky tests for their SIG?
They should, yeah.
Yeah. Today I learned that I can filter dashboards based on SIG, and I shared a link with a SIG of the CI signal workflow dashboard filtered on their SIG, and I tell you what, the reaction was interesting. Yeah, it was news. Yeah,
I can imagine. Yeah. I can imagine.
Yeah.
I think Rob's question brings up an important point, which is, so where's the role documentation for what a milestone maintainer is supposed to do?
So it was, I believe it was initially in K community and some kind of disused docs. Right now it's in the K SIG release team, and there's a section for milestone maintainers, which I see some giggles. It's not exactly discoverable.
Right.
Yeah. The bottom of the stairs behind the door that says "Beware of leopard."
Yes. Beware the leopard. Yes. Because I mean the thing is that, like, if you're talking about milestone maintainers having some sort of a new role, then that would require an education campaign. I mean, people are doing what they're used to doing, which is their concept of the milestone maintainer is, this is the person who gatekeeps the milestone during code freeze. And if we wanted to change that definition, it would require promulgating a change, including getting feedback from SIG leads from all over. One thing I wanted to bring in here that I think that's relevant. I've been messing around with dev stats with Lori, etc. And one of the things I think is actually relevant anytime we're talking about gatekeeping is, the number of PRs we're merging is actually down compared with last year. We are actually merging fewer PRs. So based on that, I'm not entirely sure that restricting the number of PRs that we are merging is necessarily the direction that we need to be heading in.
Yeah, I'm just going to share a link to some data I've been collecting across SIGs. Jordan's helped me a little bit here, and some of the other folks as well. But it's just an inventory of which SIGs are doing what types of processes it would lead to higher PR velocity. So I'll drop that in now.
So yeah, this kind of hops back into the point of, like, I think that some of the work that we do masks some problems, and one of the problems is triage. I decided to do a git blame, and this is not new information. I committed this 2 years ago for milestone maintainers. It's not new. It's not a new role at all. So I think that visibility and maybe re-education helps. And also with that, maybe a discussion of, is this required?
So I wanted to raise a couple points. Historically, we've had an approach where during the release, stuff just kind of merged. And then towards the end of a release, we started caring about stability, or for lack of a better word, or making sure all the tests were passing, or periodic post-submit tests, things like that. And so having a process that, when we were in code freeze, really shrank the number of people who were adding pull requests to merge, I think made sense. If we want to normalize around that higher quality approach and say tests should be passing all the time and post-submit jobs should be passing all the time, we shouldn't have a period of 2 months where stuff is just breaking and then 1 month where we're frantically fixing things before release. Then just returning to status quo of how we've run development cycles in the past doesn't seem likely to accomplish that result.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but like if we look even further into the past, wasn't the milestone always required, and we
No.
dropped that requirement?
No.
Okay.
What I would say,
We've just
what I'd say to that is, if you're doing continuous integration, you should be doing continuous integration, and whatever you do to integrate a change into the project should be done continuously. So there should be no difference in stance between the start of a release versus the end of the release. The stance that you take should be the same at all times.
I agree philosophically. That's what the reliability working group is trying to achieve. So right now, if a post-submit test starts failing, the only thing that gates is cutting a release. And so if the component or team responsible for that introduction of that failure or that flake is not aware of it or is not prioritizing fixing it, they can go months during the dev cycle with no real impact. And it just piles up things that block the release at the end of the cycle. The reliability working group is trying to feed that signal back in during the development process, so that if tests started failing post-submit, they would block merges to that area or that component during the dev process. And that would be visible to people contributing in that area.
So I'm not sure if I'm speaking to your point, but when I asked the question at the start, what I wanted to get at was that in the interaction where I displayed a vast set of flaky tests that are mainly in an observing state on the CI signal board, it would have been a little bit of a shock to that SIG member. And I got that little bit of shock expressed in the reply, which was courteous and useful. But one of the things that I would propose, and it'd be interesting to hear what Dan has to say about this, is that in terms of splitting up the work amongst CI signal shadows, what we've traditionally, what we did in the last cycle was that we said, okay, right, let's divvy up the jobs amongst the team. But I'd like to suggest that instead of this being that the CI signal team are a supportive part of the job of triage and managing the vast, sometimes vast number of jobs that are flaking for a specific underlying reason, and that we almost act as PM/drivers to assist SIGs rather than, if you know what I mean, work in a collaborative way to go, right, I take one of my shadows and say, right, you're looking after SIG scalability. These are your flaky tests. Help them update these tests, interact with them. Because on the one hand, they're working hard to do the work to fix underlying issues. And on the other hand, I'm going, well, you're just a SIG to me. I have a load of SIGs. I have a lot of reporting to do back to the release team. So I could turn around and say to them, update your cases on this board, or I could say, okay, right, let's take a shadow and let's have them work through this, and kind of almost like be a mini program manager for working through, say, a raft of flaky tests, because you want people doing the work, but you kind of need to see the work happening in order to report it back and up. But there's a part of me that wants to say, well, update your tests here, and update the reports here, but I think the pushback will be, well, we're working hard and it's just wait and it'll get sorted out, but we're working our own issues, you know.
Yeah, I agree that, I think I agree with what you're saying, which is we need to improve visibility and involvement of the SIGs so that the signal is usable. Is that what you're?
I just kind of feel, and these are feelings now, I feel like when I show up and go, hi, I'm Rob, I'm from CI Signal, it's kind of like, who, you know? So and then on the pushback that I sometimes get, it's like it's just an interesting piece of pushback, and I just want to change the conversation so that I'm arriving at it in a supporting role rather than a combative one, you know.
Yeah, this is definitely something we've been engaging SIG leads on. The leads and chairs calls, been talking about these tools and these dashboards and these queries, and communicating that triage of these things, visibility to these things, and addressing these things needs to be part of your regular SIG processes. There's a lot of variety in how engaged different SIGs are, so it's definitely a process. But I agree, it should not be like the CI Signal team's job to like show up and convince SIGs to address test failures.
Yeah, like, I mean, there's it could be that it might be useful for me to sit in some of those meetings and just do a little bit of advertising and promotion of the work that we do and how we can help, rather than, you know, pitch it that way, I think.
What about having folks in the SIGs who would specialize, like being the CI Signal contact within that SIG? We've talked about federating this effort in the past, and that's basically it. So yeah.
This is the kind of thing I would expect a milestone maintainer to do.
Yeah.
Mm.
So when I was doing the data collection for the spreadsheets that you see, I had some conversations about this, and it's quite clear that some SIGs definitely need to figure out their onboarding process. Like, they know it, but they need to onboard new contributors, and CI Signal would be one way to do that without expecting the new contributor to have all of the experience of somebody who's been in this project for 5 or 6 years. So I think that could be one way to get that federation going. But the problem is that these SIGs still of the mind that they don't have time.
There's a lot of if the work was super simple, it would just get done. And I think the challenge is the work is not super simple in terms of the effort required in order to deflake a test. I think one of the things that you need going in to deflake a test is deep knowledge of the functionality around which the test is operating. So that's one chunk of knowledge that you need. But then in addition to that, and this is where I'd see an external team like CI Signal eventually helping, is you also need to have a lot of knowledge of how CI works on Kubernetes. And really the challenging part is not so much looking up prior job configurations or anything like that, or job configurations or even test configuration. It's more, well, what happened when the test ran? And I think that's probably where the challenge lies, and where the most distasteful part of deflaking a test is. Now, again, education is the answer, and education and training is the answer, I think, there. But you have to arrive, I really feel you have to arrive with deep knowledge of the thing being tested.
Yeah, and in that, I think that it's almost unfair for the CI Signal team at times to have to work through and report on those issues. You know, some of what we've noticed over the cycles is that a lot of this becomes reporting, you know, reporting and reactive as opposed to proactive work, because we do not have the context that someone who works day to day in a SIG will.
Yeah, that's yeah, that's why I'm, you know, that's why I'm going full tilt on automating the reporting, because that's the first thing I want to get rid of to do this work, because I want that done. So yeah, I need help on that. There's a couple on an issue I've logged that, and I want to get that done, but we can discuss that another time. But yeah, I've put out a call for help on that.
Just to clarify, so the people who would be best at doing the CI Signal work are also the people who are best at doing all the other things like feature development? Is it?
It's
a tricky
no
one.
way, yeah.
I would see it as potential. Ideally, in a way, you'd want to be. There's a part of me that thinks, well, this should be the Montessori school for a Kate's contributor, because you get in here, you find out what you're. Actually, Montessori is a good description of it, because you play in this CI playground, and you get to interact with all of the SIGs and all the different parts of Kubernetes, and you kind of go, oh, do you like dinosaurs? Well, SIG dinosaur, off you go. You know, so it is the place to play, and that's what I'm saying to Shadows, that in terms of people, in terms of technology, you know, in terms of what you want to learn, this is a good place to figure it out. But I agree with Stephen that there's so much work to be done in the space that I know I'm certainly getting lost in it, and I'm happy to stay in it for quite some time. I see it almost as an 18 to 36 months journey to get this, you know, going really, really sweetly.
So I really love the Montessori school of Kubernetes. That's really how I see the release team, right? We have hands into multiple SIGs and component areas, and we often see people go off and lead those areas afterwards, right? So it is kind of like a nice ingress point for the community overall, but very much so it is getting thrown into the fire sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Figuring out documentation, figuring out processes, working through you know, working through areas where people might be overburdened. So, you know, we have to continue to do the work that we can to alleviate some of that burden, but we also have to make sure that the work that we're doing does not mask work that other people should be doing.
Do we think that the recent documentation efforts that Rob and Dan and others are undertaking, will we keep going with those? Do we think that that can actually help our Montessori school with having some artifacts that can get folks in the SIGs a little farther along?
Well, one of the issues that people keep sort of touching on but not expressing here, one of the reasons why, you know, a wide variety of SIGs don't pay attention to ETE and other post-submit test failures is because there's a delay and there's often no direct connection between the code they merged and the test failure. And it seems like the biggest thing that we could do to improve that situation is to try to close that loop as much as possible. You know, the fact that you say, okay, well, the SIG should have somebody on active duty for figuring out, you know, what broke, et cetera. Having been CI Signal for the release team, et cetera, the figuring out which merge broke the upgrade ETE test is a really complicated process. And I can completely understand somebody who's stacked with work putting it off. You know, and they don't necessarily intend to put it off for 2 months. They put it off one day at a time. And then at that point, it's even harder to figure out what broke things.
Especially if
stacked with work for a lot of us means the day job, where
Yeah.
if we have a quality focus there, it's probably a product related thing, and you get kind of this tragedy of the commons scenario where there are very few people who are paid to focus on the job that we're talking about right now in the community, which means it's easier to put off.
I'll throw in real quick. I'm Eddie, by the way, CI Signal Shadow. I work mostly on SIG CLI up until this point. But last cycle, Dan popped into the SIG CLI channel and was like, hey, I need someone to take a look at this flaky test. It's failing. And I saw it. I'm like, okay. And then like 6 hours later, he's like, hey, I still need someone to take a look at this. So I volunteered to do it and popped in and was greeted with my first look at test grid and was very confused, right? So like as someone new who wanted to jump in and contribute there, that tool is very intimidating. That is not an intuitive tool at all for someone who's not familiar with it. So basically what I'm saying is like, does the user experience need to be improved there for developers, right? Like how many people are opening that page, bouncing and not contributing because they just get lost while what they're looking at? You know, is that something like this, you know, obviously the SIG is super tight on resources, but like, is that something that the CNCF can provide funding for, right? If we wanted to have someone build out a proper tool or something.
So I think, you know, I think part of that goes back to education, right? And the, you know, Test Grid is an open source tool now. It's a question of, can you get the information that you need from maybe the Test Grid README page, right? And does the Kubernetes documentation say in test infra correlate to how you would do triage at this point in time? Can we easily answer that question, right? And you know, the new and shiny is sometimes cool, especially as it relates to like improving developer experience. But at the same time, we're already talking about an area that may be underfunded in terms of in terms of overall effort, right? And considering having like who rolls that tool out, right? Who necessarily develops that tool. So I think that, you know, education on the tools that we have today and deciding to see if we can identify gaps in those tools, like if they truly are gaps in the tool, are there gaps in documentation or gaps in training? I think that we have the ability to, not necessarily easily, but you know, we have the ability to train and we have the ability to document, and we have a wealth of people who have that knowledge, right? Given the time, right? Given the inclination is of course always there. We're open community, happy to help as often as we're able, but sometimes it's time, right? So I think that, you know, we often target the things that I know, you know, when I'm dealing with things on my plate, often it's like, where's the next fire, right? And you're jumping for the fire first, right? If the release process breaks down, right, you know, Tim or I will drop what we're doing, or the release managers will drop what we're doing, and try to sort that out first. So often, you know, people are running from, and this goes for all approvers who are also, you know, who are also test reviewers and deflagers and reviewers, approvers, KEP writers, program managers for their SIGs, like kind of the omnibus role. It's, yeah, sometimes you're jumping from fire to fire, right? So I think, yeah, I'll shut up. Go for
So
it, Tim.
would it make, I was gonna,
Sorry. Yeah, go for it, Lori.
Tim, I'll just do a quick, I'm wondering if we think that improving the UX of Test Grid is something that we want to look into and educate. So I guess what you're saying, what I was asking about was like, we're making some documentation and other efforts to improve the materials to use Test Grid and do CI signal. So maybe someone like Eddie, who's looking at this tool with fresh eyes, we can collect the data from Eddie and maybe the other shadows about what friction points they're seeing when they try to use test grid, or if they're going out into other SIGs and hearing the same kind of feedback, that we just make a plan based on the user feedback. And then I guess the question after that would be like, who would do that work? Would it be in this group, or would it be testing? Would it be, yeah, okay.
So I was
So
going to comment that TestGrid is open source now, which wasn't the case going back a ways. And we've had for years some discussions around that. So there is a venue for that. With only 8 minutes remaining, though, I think we need to circle back and focus in on decision.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
I've got two things right now that I've heard. One, we need to do some enhanced education communication planning. And then we still have on the table the PR. I'm hearing consensus to merge it. Any objections?
I'm in favor of dropping the requirement until code freeze, like we've done in previous releases.
I have been swayed. I think that it is not necessarily fair to people who may not have the information that they need to act accordingly. Prior to this re-education, I don't think we should move from the status quo until we figure that out.
Yeah, I do think that in the 120 timeframe, we want to continue pushing on SIGs to pay attention to their CI signal and continue making that easier for them with queries and dashboards and things. And I would like to see progress on the reliability working group, which SIG Release is one of the driving SIGs on, to automate some of that scoped signal feedback.
Sorry, I misspoke. I didn't mean to say proper tool when I was talking about we need something better there. I meant user experience wise. So no offense to anyone who's worked on that tool. I'm sure it's great.
Can I just quickly add to that, is that if when you interact with TestGrid and you see something, you think you have a good suggestion, if you make that suggestion, it will be acted on if it's reasonable and easily implementable. So I've given feedback to TestGrid developers before, and it's been acted on, and I've always been grateful and happy with that.
Yeah, I would suggest that we think about how we organize that feedback so that we can create a roadmap kind of organically based on what folks new to the tool discover along the way, and then like test that data. Like, is this something we've heard before? Okay, clearly this is something that needs to be improved.
We should make it clear again that TestGrid is not a SIG Release owned project in any way.
Oh, of course.
So when we say the we mean the collective we of the Kubernetes project and all that good stuff. But TestGrid is not maintained by us, so we should make sure that we funnel that feedback towards SIG testing, test infra, and the maintainers of TestGrid.
No, that's where it would live and where it would go. So.
All right, so I see that we have 5 minutes left. It sounds like I'm releasing the hold on this PR as the meeting ends. And we have a few more topics. I don't know if we want to try to grab one that is quick. Lori, you've got a few.
Mine are all quick. They're just really providing info to this group so they're aware of things going on. One thing is that we're clearing out a lot of old items by just a combination of walking the project board and the release team meetings, and also doing a threading effort in Slack. So one item at a time goes into Slack. Hey, what's going on here? People talk about it. Then we have an action, either to close or move forward. So that's going pretty well. And that includes retro items from docs. So retro items didn't even see the light of GitHub issue day, and GitHub issues from past retros, plus a variety of other things. So thanks for everyone for contributing. And everyone's welcome to provide their feedback. They go in either the SIG release channel or the release engineering, release management channel for now. A few in enhancements too. And then the next item is release engineering has a ways of working agreement in progress. So this is just basically, you can click on it and look at your leisure, but basically how we like to run meetings, discuss decisions that we need to make, the mechanics of how release engineering can operate. So everybody's aware of how the efforts, how the ceremonies and other actions work, and has a say in influencing the direction. So it's a work in progress. And again, if you're in release engineering and active there, please take a look and add your feedback. We're eager to hear from you.
Lori, let's scooch back for the triage party stuff.
Yep. Yeah, that won't be, we can't get through that today.
All right.
And the last item in question is you walking the project board. So is it still a goal for this meeting? We have not been successful in doing much project board walking. So maybe we just Slack thread it for now, but I just want to keep it on everybody's radar screen that walking that board in a meeting is helpful for delegation, discussion, pairing up people who are experienced with newcomers. There's all sorts of good reasons to walk the board in a meeting setting.
So I think that as we drain all of the work that we're doing to ensure freshness will bring us to a point where we can more easily walk the board during a meeting. I think we stopped doing it because it was just like, hey, remember this stuff from 2015?
And then Cherish Party, the thing we won't talk about right now, but maybe next time, is going to help us too.
I just wanted to share, I rolled out the deployment of that for SIG CLI. I put a link to it on the agenda. So if you have any questions about setting that up, feel free to ping me. It's awesome, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you so much for helping with that.
I'm also going to link the SIG release triage party one in here. So we've recently updated some of the configuration, the overall version, and hold on. And Arno added some new queries for bug triage. So check that out. Yeah, we'll try to go into that in more detail for the next meeting, I guess. All right. Well, it was a pleasure hanging out with you all. Thank you for the thoughtful and super useful discussion. We will catch you all at the next one. Have a great day.
Thank you. Have a good one.